Welcome to Celebrity Interviews with Paul. I have with me today Scott Peterson. There are lots and lots of Scott Petersons in the world.
So many.
This one is the author of comics, young adult books, adult novels. 2 years, he was my college roommate, which of course he is most proud of. He is the author of Truckus Maximus and soon to come out in softcover Batman Kings of Fear. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks, Paul. How are you?
I am amazing.
Excellent. You always were. Yeah, surviving my 2 years living with you. You're right. That is my proudest accomplishment.
Well, you got to set the bar.
Surviving 2 years living in an Otis and Rebecca lighthouse.
Oh, Otis is on Charles Street. Oh,
yes.
I remember when we realized he'd put a 2x4 between two of the houses he owned so that they wouldn't fall in on each other.
Yep. Oh my God, those were such pits, such holes.
Oh, and the one where if you spilled liquid on the floor, it would just drain through the floorboards in about 5 minutes and just be gone. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I thought the other day, I remembered that young couple. They were late 20s, early 30s, and they had, I think, a baby. I don't think it was even a toddler, and they moved in next to us. And I don't think they lasted 2 weeks before they were gone. And I suddenly remembered them, and I felt so terrible. Like, that must have been horrible.
We were horrible people. Yeah.
Yep.
Of course, we had Frank living next to us too. You remember Frank with his aluminum subsistence? Yeah, the mayor and his subsistence recycling program that I subsidized by driving his stuff in my truck to the
an early environmentalist that exactly had to add to the carbon footprint by having you drive him everywhere.
Absolutely. I was a one-way ticket though. I had to go to class afterwards.
All right.
So we're here to talk not just about reliving all of our college joys, but talk about you as a writer. You work in the comic field and the graphic novel field and that kind of stuff. So what got you there? What was the first comic you read or that inspired you or like spoke to you?
So when I was a kid, we lived in a fairly small town outside Hartford, Connecticut, and there weren't really any comics. Every once in a while, my mom would let me buy something off the spin rack, in the grocery store, that kind of thing. And the very first, I feel like I always had seen comics. I don't remember ever. So actually, even younger, when I was like 4, I loved the Adam West Batman show. Loved it.
Yeah.
Watched it in reruns. I often say that Batgirl from that show is the first woman I've ever truly loved. And
absolutely.
I was Batman obsessed. And but it was later when I remember there was a comic, Batman number 277, where where he's fighting this swamp creature, like almost like a creature from the Black Lagoon type thing. And I was just so into this because at the time, right, it's whatever it is, the mid 70s, all American boys or kids are into things like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and, the Yeti and all that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So Batman fighting sort of like one of these, perhaps legendary monsters, and at the end he gets the girl. I was
everything.
I did. I was the youngest in my class, and I was small for my age, so I was really, I was a pipsqueak.
Yeah.
My brothers were really good athletes, and so Batman was so cool. He was so smart. He was going up against like swamp monsters, and he got the beautiful woman. Like, I was like, this is the coolest thing I have ever seen in my life. I read that thing to tatters. Absolutely loved it. Later, my oldest brother, Jay, started collecting for about 3 years. He collected a lot of DC and Marvel. And so I just read that 3-year collection over and over and over again. And then, unlike most people who go into comics, I pretty much stopped reading comics almost entirely. Like, just junior high, high school. I would sometimes read Jay's, but it never even really occurred to me to go and seek out a new one. It just, I don't know. It was just something I had loved as a kid and still liked, but never, I was into music and stuff like that. So
Yep.
I was actually in 7-Eleven in Fredericksburg,
Mm-hmm.
and it was a late night beer run,
Yeah.
and I was probably getting like one of those incredibly old slices of pizza or hot dogs that was, right there. And I remember I
Yeah.
looked over and I saw a spin rack that had a Batman comic on it, and I thought, I used to love Batman. I haven't read one, in 10 years, I haven't read one. I wonder if they're any good. And I went and I picked it up, and I was just instantly captivated. And the next time I was buying beer, which was probably a couple days later, bought another one, and suddenly that was it. I was just completely and totally into comics, and that was my first of 2 junior years. So that was the semester before I met you.
Okay.
So that by the time we were living together, I was absolutely
Yes.
comic book obsessed.
Well, I remember your big boxes and in all
Yeah.
in the plastic bags, and you were very meticulous about them. And I was like, no, I would stay away from that because it looks scary. He cares a lot about it, so I don't want to mess it up. So, well, when did writing become the thing that became what you do? How did that come to be?
That is a good question. I'm not sure I ever really thought I would be a writer. I'm not sure what I thought I was going to be, but it wasn't going to be a writer. I think I hoped, foolishly, because I wasn't good enough, that I'd become a professional musician. Make it with a band. I loved reading when I was a kid. So Stephen King was an obsession. Lord of the Rings. But I'm not sure. I was never one of those kids who wrote stories. I just wasn't. I would, I wrote them for assignments in class.
Sure. Yeah. I did that too. And then read voraciously on the side. But yeah.
So it was the first year that we were living together. Is that right? I feel like it was the first year. But that
was on Charles Street with Muscarella and Tom Firesheets and Rizzo.
Yeah, but the thing that I'm confused about is I can picture where I was, but the timing doesn't actually line up. But anyhow, one night, you and I and Tommy and Muscarella and Riz all went out to the Irish Brigade, and it was the only time the whole year that the 5 of us lived together that we did that. We went out, and all 5 of us. That was just about the most hammered I've ever gotten in my life. I mean, I was just beyond blotto. I was out of my mind. And I think my recollection is all 5 of us were. It was towards the end of the year. So senior year was approaching for the other 3.
Yep.
And later that night, Lissa asked me if you could do anything. Because I think I was saying, graduation, don't know what I'm going to do with life. And Lissa said, basically, don't think, just answer. If you could do anything in the whole wide world, what would it be? And I said I would write a Batman story for my favorite artist, Jim Aparo, to draw. And she, being Lissa, was like, okay, I have a goal. I can now work towards this. So the next day, she found a number for DC Comics in New York City. She called them up and she said, how does someone get an internship? And they said, you write to this person. And so the next day she was like, hey, guess what? I found out how to get an internship at DC Comics. We just need to write to this person. And never would have occurred to me in a million years to do this. But the funny thing is we then tried to write the letter together and got in the first and still worst fight of our life. She kicked me out of the office and said, I'm just going to do this. She wrote the letter. I came in, I looked at it. I was like, oh yeah, that's so much better than I could have done. She had me sign it. We sent it off. And it was a little while later. I was outside, whatever the name of the big theater on, I think, Princess Anne Street was, with Sean Michael Dargan and Chris Bonner. And Lissa came running up because the guy from DC had just called to say, hey, I got your letter. And, we have an internship opening up, whatever it was, June 1st, if you want it. And that was it. She got me the internship. And the internship, it turned into a job. About somebody quit about 6 weeks into my internship. Somebody quit, and the guy offered me a full-time staff position. And after I said, oh my God, thank you so much, I said, I have to ask you, you have to get so many applications for internships.
Mhm.
Why did
Sure.
you pick me? Like, he didn't even
Yeah.
interview me. He just said, it's yours if you want it. I said, why'd you
Right.
pick me? And he said, oh, it was that letter. Best letter I've ever gotten in my entire career.
You owe it all to your wife.
I absolutely owe it all to my wife, 100%.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, now you write young adult, and you
Yep.
write adult, and you write comics. A lot of that geared towards a younger audience. So, do you have a responsibility to them in the stories you tell and the way you write, and like, what does that do for what you do?
So, I remember reading in, I think it was a keynote speech that the YA author Philip Pullman, who wrote the Golden Compass, he gave a speech to, my recollection was, it was a librarians association, and he said, people frequently ask me, why do you write YA?
Mm-hmm.
And this was 20, 25 years ago, when YA was just starting to become sort of acceptable, and it was still considered, when are you going to write real books?
Right.
And he said, I write YA because children's books are the only books which have the courage to actually ask the big questions.
Mm.
Now, I'm not sure I agree with that entirely, but
Sure.
I actually liked the take. His point was, modern literature is usually, it's all about, not all about, it's frequently gorgeously written, but it's about very small things.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas children's books are about the big, huge questions, right? And the stakes are so high. The same can actually be said of speculative fiction, of sci-fi and fantasy and horror, and that kind of stuff. But I actually really liked that. And I realized, thinking back over my life, there were a ton of books that I loved, a ton of novels, but the ones that I went back to again and again, with the exception, I suppose, of Lord of the Rings, did tend to be, children's books. They're so formative. And one of the things that I do like is that they tend to also, in addition to having these big, important themes and topics, they're also all about the story.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always been a big fan of vignettes and ambiguous endings and things like that. But I also think that stuff's actually a lot easier, and that having a story that is clear and engaging and exciting, but that wraps up in a satisfying way, is just so incredibly hard.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about storytelling masters who have actually really affected me, one of the people I go back to again and again is Chuck Jones, who directed most of the best Looney Tunes.
Okay.
Most of the best Roadrunners and Bugs Bunny.
Yep.
If you start listing your all-time favorite, Elmer Fudd, whatever episodes, if, list as many as you can, 20, 30, there will have been 5 different directors, but Chuck Jones will have done like 2/3 of them, because he did How the Grinch Stole Christmas. He's a genius at telling something that is completely accessible to a 4-year-old and appropriate for a 4 or 5-year-old, right? Depending on how much violence you're okay with. But a 30-year-old, a 70-year-old can watch some of these Bugs Bunny cartoons or the Grinch, How the Grinch Stole Christmas, for the 15th time and still laugh, because he's just a master of storytelling in terms of, setup and payoff, surprise, all of that. So he's sort of my my platonic ideal of how to create a story for kids.
Right. Yeah.
I did start writing, when I started writing for kids, it was, our second had just been born. So I guess I had roughly a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old. And yeah, by that point, many of my favorite comics were very adult. Things like Sandman and Swamp Thing and Watchmen, V for Vendetta. And I loved those. Those changed my life. But I also found there to be something incredibly richly satisfying about writing or editing a comic that is accessible to a 5-year-old, but that a 25-year-old can also not only find enjoyable and satisfying, but can probably tell, hopefully, like, wow, there were actually extra layers to that a 5-year-old won't have gotten. And I don't mean like hiding sophisticated,
Sure.
sex jokes or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, I find that really, it's actually really, really difficult. I wrote a bunch of Scooby-Doo comics at one point, and somebody talked about how easy it must have been. And I was like, oh, writing Scooby-Doo well is so much harder than writing Batman, because it's kind of like somebody tells you to write a joke. Okay, so that may be hard, that may be easy, but then they say it has to be a knock-knock joke, and it has to be legitimately funny. Like, wow, okay, I can write a knock-knock joke, but making one that's actually funny, that's hard. And then they say, now do 10 more of them. Like, I can't do that. That's really hard. That's what it was like writing Scooby-Doo. It was like writing a knock-knock joke that had to be a legitimate knock-knock joke, but be surprising, be funny, and then I had to do a bunch more. It was really hard. It's like trying to paint something and all you have are 3 colors. It's going to be a lot harder to do, presumably, for most people, than if you have a dozen colors or unlimited colors.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Well, yeah, it does. And although unlimited is its own problem.
Yes, it is. I'm a big believer in the Robert Frost thing about artists need walls to push against.
Yeah. Well, just try and go select laundry detergent at the grocery store.
Yes, option paralysis is a real thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, do you have a teacher or mentor that taught you something that has stuck with you, or that you carry with you?
I was insanely lucky enough when I was getting into comics, I quickly realized that for me, there were 2 writers that stood just head and shoulders above everyone else. Alan Moore, who created Watchmen and V for Vendetta and From Hell and a bunch of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and Denny O'Neil. Denny was the one who, again, I loved the Adam West Batman TV show from the 60s, really goofy.
Yeah, sure. Camp all the way.
Exactly. And it was a massive sensation, right? But it quickly burned out after only a couple years, at which point sales of Batman were just in the toilet. They were just nothing. And they brought Denny in, who was at the time this young rebel, to rejuvenate Batman. Well, I guess that's not true. They hired Denny to write Batman, and he ended up rejuvenating him by basically going back to how Batman was when he was first created in 1939, which was this really dark, grim detective. Denny only had Batman out at night, ever. No more daylight scenes, things like that.
Right.
He went back to his detective work, went back to his gothic roots, and really, really turned Batman around. And it was crazy. When I was at DC Comics, I got hired to be his assistant editor on the Batman books. So suddenly I'm working with my one of my 2 favorite ever writers, and he was one of those. He was a student of story. So he would analyze and break down everything. Comics, novels, movies, TV shows, and he's the one that introduced me to the concept of the 3-act structure and how a story has to be, has to have certain elements in certain orders that, to some extent, it's almost like a sonnet, right? There's a form, but what you do within that sonnet, is basically infinite. And it's really funny because I just, I don't know about you, but we learned a little bit about, like, in high school, like freshman year, about like rising action and climax and denouement and all that.
Sure.
But never learned about 3-act structure, never learned about the inciting incident, never learned any of that kind of stuff that I think is fairly well known these days, but in 1991 or whatever was not at all.
Yeah.
And, Denny used to say, you took writing classes in college. What did they teach you? And I'd be like, how to find my voice, I guess. I don't really know. We never did you ever talk about structure?
I don't remember talking about structure. I took one creative writing class, and I remember write what you know.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah,
that's that. And so it just, even I remember taking American Lit with, I don't remember who he was. He hated me. He did. And I was trying. He just, man, he did not like me. But I do remember at one point thinking, we're reading whatever it was, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man or something. And I'm thinking, we always talk about the themes of the books, talk about subtext, we talk about all this stuff, but like we never actually just talk like, is it good? Is it like, like, and I'm not saying like I want to sit around for 4 weeks being like, oh, Moby Dick was awesome, but there's a reason we still read it. It's really exciting. It's cool. Can we take like 2 minutes when we start a book to be like, how great was this book, right? But they never do that. They never do that. It's like enjoying the book was verboten.
Well, that's kind of beneath it though.
Yeah.
Like if you actually enjoy it, you're probably not sophisticated enough to understand why it's a good book.
That's exactly what it felt like.
You know, the other thing going on with some of those lit professors, when I was in Fredericksburg at a parish there, I tried to do some like religion and non-fiction and talk to some of those professors about doing some kind of presentations or like lectures at my church or things like that. And I talked to the guy who taught like contemporary religious, like he was talking about like, maybe it was even in the religion department talking about like contemporary literature. And I'm asking him, and every book he's mentioning is 30 years old. And I've got this list of like, 3-year-old books that are really interesting and sophisticated and talk about theological themes. And I'm like, have you read anything in the last decade?
Right.
Or even like tried to add a book to your syllabus and maybe take something off from 1953?
Right.
Or maybe, I mean, that was just kind of, I think there's also that kind of like, there's that comfort in being tenured.
Yes, I'm sure.
That is a blessing and a curse.
So it's not just write what you know, it's teach what you know. And
and keep teaching what you know, and don't get too creative because that's too much work.
Right.
Yeah. Oh.
So
well,
go ahead.
No.
Well, I was just going to say, so basically Denny taught me about the importance of story structure. At the time, pretty much everybody on staff at DC Comics was sent to the Robert Mckee story structure seminar that he would give a couple times a year. I don't know if you ever saw the Nicolas Cage movie adaptation, but in it, one of the two twins that Nicolas Cage plays goes to a story structure seminar. That's literally the seminar that I went to, where it was amazing. 3 days of him just breaking down movies into like structurally and showing how they fit and where the act one turn is and that kind of thing. It was phenomenal. It was amazing. So that was really helpful. That was huge.
Cool.
Yeah.
Right. And understanding.
Yeah.
So where do you get, where's your muse? What inspires you? Where do you get your ideas?
It's funny, when I was walking around DC, when I was walking around New York City at one point, and I remember doing that thing that they claim you can always tell the tourists because they're the only ones who look up in New York. But I was looking up. I lived there, but I was looking up, and it was just, you could see Batman or Spider-Man, like ideas everywhere walking around that environment. Later, moving to rural Virginia was pretty different. But I've actually, it's a very strange thing. When I started as an editor, I was working with these writers and my fellow editors who just, man, the ideas just, they were nonstop. It was crazy. About every 8 or 9 months, the editors and our writers would get together for like 2 or 3 days and plot out roughly the next year's worth of stories. And some of these guys, they're just, and I'm not exaggerating, they're coming up with 2 or 3 ideas a minute. Well, we could do this. Well, how about a story where this? Well, we could, and they're just ping-ponging off of each other. And I would just sit there and I'd be like, I don't get it. I don't know how you do this. I get like an idea a day if I'm lucky. How do you do this?
Right.
But it actually, excuse me, after a couple of years, I was more up to like an idea an hour rather than a day. And after a few more years, I was able to keep up with them, because it turns out that I think, at least for me, creativity is like a muscle. And the more you exercise it, I had never really exercised it. And the more I exercised it, the stronger it became. So that it's kind of a crazy thing. But if if I need an idea, they'll sometimes strike out of nowhere. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's a very weird thing. I used to get all my ideas when I was walking to or from the subway.
Okay.
I would just be like, all right, I got to think of an idea. And I would get a half a block and I'd be like, oh, it'd be kind of cool if blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Uh, since I don't have a walk to the subway, and I found that just walking around my neighborhood doesn't do the same thing. Sometimes
Yeah.
driving, not very often. I am absolutely at my least creative when actually sitting in front of the computer with Microsoft Word open. That is
Yeah.
the
Well,
Sahara.
that's the kiss of death for most people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I have found, and it's the strangest thing, I don't know why it is, if I hop in the shower, I will have an idea within 30 seconds. Something about the sound and the rhythm of the water just
Yeah.
activates some part of my brain, so that when I was writing Truckus Maximus,
Yeah.
there were times I was literally taking like 4 showers a day. I
was
would
gonna
hop,
ask you how many times a day do you shower?
dude, it's crazy. Like, I would hop in the shower because I'd be like, okay, what happens in the next scene? I'd hop in the shower. I would hop back out like 90 seconds later, and my family learned, like, if I'm wet, like, with a towel wrapped around me, don't talk to me. I would go, and I would have like 3 pages that I had to just transcribe. It had come to me like that. And the thing is, it's the strangest thing. It comes to me like complete. It's not like, oh, this happens, then this happens, and this happens. It's like, funk, all this happens. It's so strange.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah, so our water bills are sky high.
Yeah, but you're making great product. You're writing great books. So, where do you find joy these days?
It's funny. So there's a couple places. The main ones are, we have a family ritual. So we have a couple family rituals. One of them is that Saturday night, my 15-year-old daughter Kelly and her mom have art night, where for an hour and a half, they go into Lissa's studio and they create art. They're both artists. So sometimes they'll be on a painting kick. Sometimes, they'll be trying out these new watercolors, or they're trying out these new pencils, or trying out a new iPad app for drawing on the iPad, whatever. And they'll frequently listen to a book on tape as they do it, or they'll watch something on YouTube, like a tutorial on how to shade with this kind of mechanical pencil. While my oldest 3 kids and I watch an episode of, we've gone through various TV shows over the years. For the past couple years, for the past whatever, I guess year and a half, we've been watching just Law and Order: Criminal Intent. They are so into it. So we eat ice cream and we watch Law and Order: Criminal Intent, and they are just like, Saturday night is everybody's favorite night, and it's just, I love it. It just makes me really happy. My kids are at the point, like, I loved having little kids. Lissa laughs at me because we go for a walk pretty much every day, and I'll see like a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, like, playing ball or something.
Sure.
And she can tell that my heart's just breaking, because God, I miss having like a 3-year-old or 4-year-old climb up. I love that age so much. But it is really cool, I have to say, to have, kids who are 20 years old. Kate's 25, and she's a real person. Like, she's really interesting. Like, it's really cool to be able to learn so much from your kids. And I don't just mean like, they've taught me what's really important about life, because that is true. That's 100% true. But I mean, like, be like, hey, did you know that? Like, I did not know that, and that's really interesting. Like, they, teach me so much, and they're fun to talk to. They're funnier than I am. It's awesome. So that is probably joy, is that. And I am currently reading Lord of the Rings out loud to my youngest 3 kids. It's the either 3rd or 4th time that I've read it out loud, because I've read it to subsequent kids. And it's the last time that I'm ever going to read it out loud. And I read out loud. So I've been reading bedtime stories now for 24 years or whatever, right? And 5-6 nights a week, I read bedtime stories. and I pretty much always love it. I really do.
Mhm.
But some
Yeah.
books are harder than others. And
Yeah.
there are times where I'll read for 10 or 15 minutes. And with Lord of the Rings, like I'll be shaking Sean awake, like, hey, we're not done
We're
yet.
not done
Wake
yet.
up.
Keep going.
And he's like, you've been reading for 45 minutes. I'm like, yeah, but this is a good part.
I know.
They're all good parts. So
Yeah.
I absolutely love reading to my kids at night. Those are probably my biggest joys is hanging out with my kids, which sounds so pat and saccharine and gushy, but it's true. I just really freaking like my kids. So
Beautiful.
thank you.
Beautiful thing.
Yeah,
Thank
it is.
you.
It is.
Thank you for being part of Celebrity Interviews with Paul, and it's great to reconnect.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. Very, very happy we did this. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely.